So I guess most people are pretty tired of COVID-19 and what it all means, etc. So we thought we would switch gears and start working more closely with our partner in Basel, namely Basel area and Day One, and start looking at the ecosystem as it bounces out of COVID and starts growing forwards, and start doing some comparisons. So the synopsis remains unchanged from the one that was shared with you. It clearly is around the fact that we at Galen Growth, and I don't think Day One believes any differently to us, that believe that COVID-19 has accelerated digital health into the spotlight more so than it's ever been before. And I think, as the CEO of Microsoft put it, 3 years of digitization occurring in 3 months. I don't think it's too far away from that in terms of the sheer level of appetite and engagement we're seeing from corporations and investors as relates to digital health. And that's pretty much very clear in the US. If you look at their numbers this last 6 months, it's gone even bigger than previous 6 months. And certainly we've seen that in a major bounce back in investment in Asia Pacific over the last 3 months. So I think some of that is due to the different timetable COVID-19 took to hit Asia versus the US. And I think we've seen that in terms of how investors have behaved. So anyway, all that to say that I think it's absolutely fascinating to look at two ecosystems side by side. And so to give context to those two ecosystems, let me just hand over to Dario Heyman, who's the Chief Research Officer of Galen Growth, who will share just a few slides to give you that context in numbers so that you understand just how close those two ecosystems are. And then we'll switch back to the panelists and start asking some questions. Dario, over to you.
Many thanks, Julian. And let me actually put this one a bit smaller so that people can actually also see what I'm having on my screen. So this one is actually a very nice picture what I found, which actually shows how the Matterhorn in Switzerland has been enlightened with the Singaporean flag, which I think gives a very nice context to our conversation here today. And this is actually the Weisshorn, if people know that. This is the main peak of the Matterhorn. Very beautiful. As Julian was rightly saying, is that we're looking into two very interesting ecosystems here. So a graph that was been published by Bloomberg earlier this year was showing Singapore and Switzerland being the third and fourth most innovative economies in the world, followed in just succeeded by Germany and South Korea. So making this very interesting to look at. When we're looking into our own data of what we're having, and this is actually what we want to deep dive into today, is how are actually now Singapore and Switzerland very similar to one another, and this is why we actually have this panel also on both ecosystems today. So when we are putting the two ecosystems side by side, we're seeing that in terms of number of ventures that are existing in both of those ecosystems by the end of last year, we're actually seeing that they're actually very similar in size. Singapore has roughly 215 or has 215 digital health ventures currently active in the market versus Switzerland, where slightly over 200 ventures are currently active in the market. Both have also been growing with a CAGR of 18% and 14% respectively over the past 5 years, which shows that they are not just having almost an equal number of digital health ventures, but they're also almost growing at the same speed, which again shows how similar those ecosystems are actually to one another. When we're deep diving into how do the digital health ventures are being spread over the categories, and if you've been following us for the past months, you've been seeing probably that we've been trying to showcase startups from different digital health categories, how we are classifying them. We're currently classifying digital health ventures in 52 distinct categories that are falling under 16 clusters. We're looking into those 16 clusters. We're actually seeing that wellness solutions, both in Singapore and in Switzerland, are the #1 digital health ventures, are basically where digital health ventures are the most active in, and then followed by patient solutions and medical diagnostics. So the only difference here is that Singapore actually has patient solutions as being the #2 and medical diagnostics being the #3 versus Switzerland, where those are basically vice versa. Now, the only difference is that Switzerland, as a very pharma-centric or like a home to lots of pharma companies, actually then has research here as the #4 most active digital health category, which doesn't appear in Singapore, and which when Singapore falls under the other 36% here. So you're also seeing here that there's a very huge overlap of how similar those two ecosystems are to one another when we're looking into the category distribution. When we are then looking into the funding trends in those two geographies, we're also seeing that there's a similar yet not the same trend. So when we're looking into 2017, so in 2017, the funding in both Singapore and Switzerland were somewhere between 75 and 80 million dollars. Those are always US dollars, so I'm not now having in Singapore dollars, but both are in US dollars. Only then in 2018, Singapore was actually slightly stronger versus Switzerland that succeeded Singapore in 2019, largely driven by 2 or 3 very massive deals that were happening in Switzerland during the course of last year. This year, then, however, we've been seeing that Singapore had a bit of a driver because of larger deals, to be mentioning the Holmus deal of $21.5 million and the Dr. Anywhere deal of $35 million. They have been pushing the funding in Singapore this year versus Switzerland that is still a bit lacking behind. But we are still believing that the numbers will probably grow at a similar speed over the year, so that we are probably seeing both ecosystems somewhere appearing at the same level. The very last slide before I give back to Julian is when we're looking into Switzerland, which is very different from Singapore, because in Singapore we only have one state versus Switzerland that's literally clustered in lots of different cantons, is that Zurich is actually the largest area where digital health ventures are located, with more than 40% of all digital health ventures are located in Zurich, then actually followed Stadt. So you have Basel-Stadt and you have Basel-Land. Those two ecosystems are laying, or those two cantons are laying right next to one another, which is then here the third largest ecosystem in Switzerland. Only the Vaud, which is the French-speaking part, if I'm not fully mistaken, in Switzerland is the second largest, followed then by Basel-Stadt. So very nice to see that that Galen Growth now has its office also in Basel-Stadt, and we are very much, or I'm very much looking forward to also hearing from digital health ventures coming from this region. And with this, I would love to give back to Julian so that he can guide you through the day.
Thank you very much, Darius. So some context, a bit of a gallop with some context, and obviously happy to share the data with anyone. So let's get into our debate, our discussion. So on the Singapore side, we have Grace Park, so Grace Wave, who is the co-founder and president of DocDoc. Now this is DocDoc Singapore. Just make sure you know that, because we're going to get to DocDoc Basel in a minute. So DocDoc DOC in Singapore, where you have been, I guess, since inception, Grace, in 2012. Prior to that, you had a fairly long career in Medtronic. And prior to that, and I skip a few steps along the way, a first career in the US Army. So welcome and thank you. Joining you is Serene Chai, co-founder and head of partnerships at SpeedDoc, a Singapore-born startup, where you have been since inception in 2017. Welcome, Serene. Thank you very much. On the Swiss side, so Girisha Fernando, who is either building a suntan or certainly has got himself an extremely bright background. But anyway, CEO and founder of LifeGen. We look forward to hearing a bit more about that. Prior to that, a longish career at Roche. So clearly a healthcare track from a long time. And then, of course, Ulrich Müllner, who is the CEO of DocDoc, in this case, DOCDOK. And prior to that, a longish career, let's say, at Novartis. So again, a deep route in healthcare. So we deliberately picked these 4 startups. Last time we spoke, we certainly confirmed the fact that your service offerings to patients, to HCPs, and to industry are different. So it's going to be interesting to see your perspective as you look at it. So let me start with the COVID question, and more specifically drilling into the pain point of COVID. Certainly in Asia Pac, and I'm very keen and eager to hear what both Ulrich and Girish have to say, but let me start with you, Grace, if I may. Patients, healthcare professionals, customers, particularly those going to hospitals, etc., were severely impacted during COVID-19 due to the restrictions and the lockdowns, or circuit breakers, as you like to call them in Singapore. How has this manifested itself in the way your business has gone to market, and in terms of both positive and negative, by the way? And how have you as an organization responded in order to, I guess, use Churchill's terms, never let a good crisis be wasted?
Sure, thanks, Julian. I agree with what you had said in the beginning, and that COVID has actually accelerated digital health. And what has happened for DocDoc is that it has helped us cross the finish line for a few of the deals that we've actually been working on. So DocDoc actually is not a B2C company, we're actually B2B2C. And so we partner up with insurers, employers, to help pass the value onto policyholders to help empower them in their doctor discovery process. And so I think that what has happened is that oftentimes this is not technically a priority of, there's just so many there's so many things that actually are on the plate of these big organizations. And having this happen, it really didn't disrupt it as, let me try to find something new, but it just accelerated the timeline. So something that would have in the normal course of events have taken months and months to get through to the finish line, we've actually were able to do it in a matter of weeks. I think in other aspects of this COVID crisis, unfortunately, not all companies in the healthcare space had, as positive or an opportunity and had to shut down their doors. Part of this also, we were actually able to pick up talent from the marketplace to carry on with some of the, building up the ecosystem, the talent that is in our country here. So I think that is a good thing to be able to help with the talent in the marketplace. In terms of funding, I think a lot of companies have to think through funding. How are they resourced through this period? And, for us at DocDoc, we were actually had a round last year. And so we're well funded through this crisis to get through it. And I think with a couple of the announcements that we'll be able to make at the end of this quarter or the early part of next, we'll be able to go out for another funding round here. But at the end of the day,
No, I mean, we'll come back to some of those points you made in a bit more detail going forward. But I mean, is it fair to say that a large base of your customers are insurers? And therefore, how have you seen insurers weather the storm? And I understand it's been a hell of a storm for them. And has that changed their attitude to DocDoc and how they're leveraging your capability?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that it was actually the attention it gave to the employees, the policyholders, say, hey, we've got DocDoc, and to be able to utilize it and say, we could actually have it at our fingertips. Part of DocDoc actually is we have a human touch element to it as well, where it's not all done virtually, but we help guide the patient through that customer journey. And I think in a period where there is a pandemic, where there is a tremendous amount of fear, having a doctor walk them through that entire healthcare journey, navigating through the healthcare system, has been a plus to help alleviate that fear and also to get data. I mean, the problem that DocDoc is solving and what is not there in the marketplace or what is status quo today is that there is a lack of transparency. So having information at the patient's fingertips of knowing, okay, I have this situation, who should I go see and who is my right doctor? That insight or that having that capability forefront to a patient was not known before. And so to be able to have that was something that COVID had done for us in terms of accelerating that adoption in many of the partnerships that we have.
Cool, and we'll come back to some of those pieces, particularly the topic of partnerships. Serene, let me switch to you. Different business model for SpeedDoc. So how's COVID impacted your traction, I guess, in market, particularly as relates to patients, HCPs, and consumers more broadly, suddenly find themselves to rethink how they access healthcare?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think Grace brought it up, and I think everybody in the healthcare industry would kind of like understand this as well, that COVID really accelerated societal acceptance of digital health, whether it's B2B or B2C or, B2B2C, industries that haven't been digitalized for ages, like the seafarers, the maritime industry, they've been coming to us and saying, can we have digital health solutions? It's very much a whole of organization / whole of country / whole of government approach to digital health. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that's very unique to Singapore. Maybe the Swiss panelists can weigh in later, but this is something that we've been seeing, the whole of country versus whole of organization, whole of government approach and push towards digital health. And this brings me back to a joke that I once heard, which is COVID managed to do what CTOs and CDOs didn't manage to do, which is accelerate the digitalization of industries, across the whole of society and across the whole of the world economy. And this is, creating an impact that we're seeing. It's a change that we're seeing. There's an uptake of services, societal paradigm and acceptance of telehealth, of mobile services has increased dramatically. And this is something that we're probably seeing from the consumer side as well as, what Grace said from the industry side.
Can you give us a sense of the a percentage or a number of times fold of increase in traffic that you've seen, contrast COVID versus pre-COVID?
I think it's at least 3x to 5x. I think that if you were concentrating purely on telemedicine, valuations of telemedicine companies have gone through the roof, right? I think someone brought up Dr. Anywhere just now. They've raised rounds of $27 million. And, what we're hearing from the VC side is that, valuations for purely telemed companies have gone through the roof, versus digital health companies like SpeakDoc, which has a wider range of service. We don't see that kind of crazy valuations for us. But I'm sure that if we are seeing 3 to 5x, I'm sure telemed companies are seeing maybe 10x, 20x.
Sure. Certainly, if you look at funding H1 2020 to telemedicine as a comparator to the same period last year, it's gone up 22 times in terms of sheer dollar funding into telemedicine in Asia Pacific. Okay, let's hear from the Swiss guys then. So Ulrich, across to you. So let's segue into the more sort of, let's say, B2C type model. Let's get a sense of how has the COVID environment impacted your business in terms of positive or not at all. I mean, it's entirely, I guess, up to you to describe it. But how have you as a business responded to really maximize the opportunity?
Sure. So we at DocDoc Health, we have the overarching theme, delivering personalized healthcare solutions. And under this tagline, we have, I would say, different business segments or business areas. As a first step, we have built a universal platform connecting patients with healthcare providers, particularly physicians. And based on that, we are now also working on actually developing digital therapeutics. So we have, I would say, multiple business segments. And the first business segment, clinical communication, but also real-world evidence studies. I would say this segment, we have clearly seen stronger requests by our customers because, as you know, there was physically at some point not even possible for patients to visit either the hospital and or a physician's office, or at least unless there was an emergency case. So we got a strong, let's say, interest from either office-based physicians or hospitals to, for instance, connect their patients now with them through a digital platform like ours. And just as a side mark, we are not offering telemedicine solutions, so we don't have any MD, let's say, on our payroll, but we are connecting, let's say, you with your healthcare provider. So there clearly we saw higher interest, we saw greater demand. Also as a response, since you asked that, we were able to quickly expand the functionalities of our platform. We added, for instance, video consultation, which we didn't have before and also didn't plan for because our platform was more meant as an asynchronous communication platform. But we realized in this situation, people are looking for really synchronous video-based consultations. So our IT team did a fantastic job within a few weeks to really establish that. We got a major hospital chain in Austria through that. We also actually were able to start a COVID study. So as our platform is also supporting real-world evidence studies, either at hospitals or for pharma companies, we got particularly the request with the University Hospital in Zurich to run a study with patients who are hospitalized with COVID-19 and follow them through or after release from the hospital. So this is also a project, let's say, generated through COVID, fortunately or unfortunately in this case, because obviously if you're hospitalized through COVID, this is not a fun thing to have. On the other side, on the flip side, on the digital therapeutic side, this is what we are now developing and also going forward, which is clearly one of our focus areas. There we are very much dependent on, let's say, developing our solutions also in the setting of a clinical trial. So to validate our solutions, to get data. And there we have seen in some instances that certain studies have been delayed simply because of the fact that either hospitals were not allowed to start studies because they had to really focus their resources 100% on treating COVID patients, or simply, the resources or their mindset was not yet start a study. So we have seen a few delays in study starts and more like, paperwork being done, but the actual study is being shifted by a few months. So I think these are the two observations. So really on the plus side, a stronger request for our clinical communication platform, stronger requests for certain studies. On the flip side, studies that are not COVID related, we have seen some push out or delays in starting those studies.
And this is driven by academia, government, or by strategics, as in pharma?
The studies, you mean?
Yeah.
Both. I mean, we have both partners. We have academic partners, medical centers like the University Hospital, Zurich as an example, like the Sheba Medical Center in Israel is a major partner of ours. But also, we work with pharma companies as we speak. We have studies for them, like real-world evidence studies or post-market studies, following their products in the market. But the push out, to delay these studies has mainly come, I would say, through the medical centers because they were either legally not allowed to start studies. There was really a ban on studies, or simply by due to resources, there was a decision made to move out the study by a few months.
Okay, good. I mean, some of what you're describing doesn't entirely surprise me. Certainly hearing a number of clinical trials being impacted heavily by COVID-19
exactly.
as well.
This is the same situation.
Yeah. Joshua, let's switch to you. Again, a different business model. So you will need to articulate your answer in accordance to the question in accordance with your value proposition to market. But absolutely fascinating to see how you have seen the world change and how have you guys responded.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Julian and Doug, for having me, and welcome to the audience. I'd like to speak about something very specific, which might concern all of us and really corresponds to our business model. So at LifeGen, we provide a platform for health insurances and pharma companies that allows them to bring drugs to the market and price the drugs according to their value. So depending on the benefits that they achieve for the patient, a price will be determined, which is also known as sort of value or outcomes-based pricing. Now, speaking about that specific impact of COVID, I think it's really amazing to see, especially for the public, but also for the industry stakeholders, how quickly drugs can get to the market, right, in such a pandemic. So if you look at moving from research up to really clinical trials and to market entry, this can be done in months. It's literally happening, and it has been really frustrating to see from our perspective that we have this situation, or we previously had this situation also for non-pandemic diseases, right? There are many diseases in which patients are dying or cannot access valuable treatments because there are negotiations about the price, there's discussions about value, and this we have seen as an intense impact on our business model. So what does that mean for us? We're seeing way more openness of health insurances, may that be public or private. We're seeing extreme openness from pharma to engage in such value and data-driven models for pricing their drugs, because it just has a positive impact on bringing these drugs quicker to market. So I share the numbers with Serene, talking about a 3x to 5x exposure, we've definitely seen that. And what we were at the beginning focused on is of course a close collaboration with pharma, as they are the ones bringing products to market and they want to demonstrate value. But what COVID has done for us is also extended that interest to healthcare payers that understand that they have to look more for understanding what kind of drugs are providing what kind of value for patients and paying accordingly, instead of exposing themselves with high cost prescription drugs without knowing what they're really delivering.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And let me come back to one of those points a little later on. Can I touch on regulations, please? Because it's all very well, of course, describing this sort of huge surge of focus and activity by strategics and others in relation to digital health. But one of the handbrakes, let's call it that, or headwinds in the adoption of digital health, of course, is regulations, or the regulatory attitude of governments. In Asia Pac, I'm always been pleased to see the speed of response by Asian governments. And so, for example, South Korea, that always deemed telehealth to be illegal, largely because, of course, their doctor community doesn't want it, changed that very quickly in order to enable telehealth to be leveraged in South Korea. It did cause a bit of a problem, which, of course, there are no telehealth providers in South Korea, so suddenly everyone's scrambling trying to build telehealth platforms. Japan changed, for example, the rules around script fulfillment. So you can see that there was always this continued focus on the last mile with the patient. Let's switch to, let's start with you, Serene, if I may. What have you seen by way, in terms of the various countries you operate in, but I mean, Singapore being the central focus of discussion here, what have you seen by way of new dialogue with the Singapore government, MOH, and regulators in relation to digital health and adoption of? Because we're aware of the sandbox, but that's quite a few years old now. It's still going, of course, and telehealth is the initial focus of that regulatory sandbox. But how have you seen things evolve, if at all, in the last 6 months from a regulatory standpoint?
So, well, I mean, first of all, to set a baseline, I think there are reasons why regulators are strict. So, in industries like healthcare, industries like financial services, regulations will always be there. And in healthcare, regulations, the reasons why regulations exist is always because it's going to be skewed towards, public health, population health, and patient safety. But that being said, we've always seen open communication between government as well as the players in the market. And you mentioned the sandbox, but actually that has taken a backseat to the whole COVID situation. So MWIC actually cannot keep up with the sandbox. They are retiring it, I think, in August. And the new regulations, they're not going to have time to do the regulations and launch it this year. So they're pushing that to 2022. So in terms of regulations, I think very much, what's at the forefront is fighting COVID. So I think regulations itself has taken a backseat. Other than that, I think I wouldn't fault the government for having open communication, and when they make decisions, it's very clearly communicated to us why. So, for example, one of the bigger regulations was that PCR swabs are not allowed for this and for that, and the reason was that they actually had to conserve PCR swabs so that the laboratory systems didn't break down. So, and this was very clearly communicated. Of course, if every company were to do swabs, it's a purely commercial venture, right? And then public safety would be at risk. So they always communicate the reasons why certain regulations are in place. I don't think I will fault the government for that.
Thanks, Serene. Grace, looking at it from your perspective, and trying to add in another angle, because I know it's a hot topic here in Europe, the data privacy side as well in relation to regulations, and not just the ability of a doctor to use a platform, for example, for telehealth, but also how has data privacy potentially evolved to recognize the fact that track and trace apps, those kind of things, are now regularly used in Singapore. Therefore, how has that really changed, and has that potentially changing the way you guys are looking at it?
I think one of the pluses of Singapore is that privacy, data protection has always been, top of mind here. And I think that's one of the key differences versus any other country in the region. And I think that's why a lot of companies tend to select Singapore as a headquarters. Mm-hmm. And that gives comfort for any investors who may not be from here to invest here. And so I think that what Singapore has done is pretty consistent. in terms of having PDPA, having data regulations, being very strict about it as well. So no real, so yeah, I think my answer is that it's been very consistent in the expectations of what Singapore government has done and upholding that to a very high standard.
Mm-hmm. But are you echoing Serena's point in relation to the more, let's say, medical side of regulations continuously being positive towards digital health? Have you seen an uptick of that, or has it just been the same momentum throughout the last 6 months?
If we're talking about the last 6 months, I would agree with Serene. Maybe perhaps I have coming into Singapore in 2004 and DocDoc setting shop in 2012. The early days, I mean, looking around at regulations, it wasn't updated for 15, 20 years throughout the entire Asia region. And so I think Smart Nation and a lot of these regulatory changes happened post 2014. And it was fantastic to see a lot of the, constituents, the feedback from the constituents, MOH reaching out to startups to have one-on-one meetings on a quite regular basis over the last 3-4 years. And so I think that is a very good practice for them to be, keep on the beat of what's actually happening on the ground.
Cool, thanks, Grace. Girish, I'll switch to you in order to break up this pattern. You guys are a data play, so you've talked about a new invigorated response from clients in relation to digital health. But how has the Swiss environment adapted, if at all, to the fact that in order to operate as a digital player, you need a level playing field. You also need a playing field that allows you to operate and to execute your business model.
Absolutely. Well, I think Switzerland is definitely would be considered a conservative area, right? Or country. Now, two things I can specifically mention. The one aspect is related to COVID, of course, the COVID app, right? If you look at the COVID app, the understanding that data is crucial to make informed decisions on all levels. So this includes the end user, this includes the governments, the policymakers, as well as industry. So I think that has really emphasized, even in a country like Switzerland, where we see way more conservatism, that we have to find grounds to be able to share data, of course, respecting the data privacy laws and regulations, to really make the best of dealing with the pandemic. And now what we're seeing is that this is sort of getting over to the point where it's not just about the pandemic, right? I think there was a question also from the audience to say, well, will there be sort of a go fast attitude as well as go looking for value after the pandemic. And here in Switzerland, we clearly see that this is happening, right? So the pandemic has sort of just kickstarted this process, or I would say enhanced this process, but definitely the stakeholders, especially government, is understanding that there is a huge importance to move forward. Now, specifically in our case, I would say that when you look at regulation, right, we are in a very difficult position as a startup as well, because we're dealing with drug regulation. So how are drugs being priced? Are there specific processes around that? And we want to change some of that, right? But again, because of COVID, we're seeing a huge shift in mindset. For example, in the case of remdesivir, if you look at Gilead, right, you ask the question, and this impacts all of us, what is the right price for remdesivir, right? How should it be priced? And this potentially, governments as well as public healthcare payers and private are facing a massive budget impact if this comes to market, and there are millions, potentially billions of people that could need this drug, right? So this has really sort of fostered the discussion and impacting all of that around it. So the policies on how drugs are being reimbursed, what is the process for evaluating these drugs, and then these commercial models that come into play to actually pay for those drugs.
So do you see, I mean, there's an often joke about the NICE organization in the UK that it doesn't stand for the National Institute of Clinical Effectiveness, but the National Institute of Cost Effectiveness, but largely because there's general attitude to approving drugs. But therefore, do you see Switzerland, for example, getting, and I know the Swiss healthcare system is very different to the UK one in terms of how it is reimbursed and the role insurance plays, but do you see, therefore, payors in Switzerland and then potentially in other markets you're operating in, putting a yet more emphasis in terms of the ROI of a specific treatment, particularly with budgets being blown and, whether the private payer or the public payer?
Definitely. And there's maybe two factors that are really emphasizing that or driving that forward. So one I mentioned is the pandemic, but the next aspect is sort of into Ulrich's domain, which is personalized treatments, right? So if you look at sort of the cell and gene therapies, CAR T therapies, in which the exposure of the healthcare payers is quite large. The evidence, especially in a curative setting, in which a pharmaceutical, sort of proposes a cure, but doesn't have the evidence and the experience to back that up, right? These are not usually extremely long-term studies that are conducted, so there is a lot of uncertainty. So especially in that domain, healthcare payers are now really also forced to think about how can they create a sustainable environment in which drugs can be reimbursed, not just sort of in a short term, but in a long term. And this is something that is really different to what maybe was 10, 20, 30 years ago because of these innovative therapies. We have seen a lot of innovation in terms of the therapies, right, as mentioned with the cell and gene, but we haven't seen so much innovation when it comes to policies and frameworks. So how to deal with those innovations. Product innovation, yes, but then healthcare system innovation, that's where we saw barriers, and this is starting to change, which for us means a very interesting future.
Okay, no, fascinating, and you could spend hours on this topic, no doubt, as well. But let's switch to Ulrich and find out how Ulrich has seen the regulatory environment hopefully help shape the way he's taking the doc growth strategy forwards.
And maybe I try to add a few elements which haven't been mentioned before. So because, if you look at Switzerland has a very interesting, I would say, geographical, political situation, despite the fact, or in spite the fact that it's an independent country, obviously it's closely tied to the European Union, although maybe some Swiss don't like this fact, but as a matter of fact, the EU is the major market. And what it means from a regulatory perspective is that, of course, each major regulatory change in the EU affects Switzerland, either directly or indirectly. For sure, if you want to do business in the EU, European Union, you have to adhere to those regulations. And there are two major regulations either being changed already or will be changed soon. One is obviously the data privacy, data security GDPR law, which came into effect a few years. So there's no discussion that you have to adhere to this. Lots of consequences with the fact of data hosting, the fact that you need a data privacy officer, and so lots of processes also behind that you need to adhere to as a startup, which sometimes feel that you're a major corporation in terms of rigidity of the processes. But I think, as Serena said previously, I think it's for a good cause. I mean, we are dealing with patient data, and we should make the best effort to keep those data safe and secure. I think there's no question, at least not in our industry, that we want to make a fantastic effort here to deal with that. I think the second regulation, which is has been delayed actually due to COVID, is the new medical device regulation, which was meant to come into effect May this year. But fortunately enough, this has been delayed by 1 year, because this new law means that certain software has to become a medical device, at least if you're dealing with the European Union. And this will have major impact on the go-to-market, because if you make certain claims, if your software has certain features, it has to become a medical device, either class 1 or class 2, in certain cases even higher than that. And with that, it also means that you have to be, as a company, prepared to do so. So this is I would say on the challenge side. On the positive side, from a regulatory or reimbursement side, surprisingly enough, Germany is now having a very strong lead in, I would say, even globally, in terms of reimbursement for medical grade apps, because there's a new law in place as of April this year, which the new German health minister, young guy, very eager, very ambitious, brought into place actually already prior to COVID, but now through COVID, I think we see even a stronger rationale for this law. And this means that in Germany, if you meet certain standards, if you have a medical grade app, if you have certain real world efficacy data proving the claim that you're making, you have a direct path to reimbursement for this medical solution. And this is clearly a trend or a market opportunity we are now betting on, and we are really shifting our efforts towards this opportunity, because as I said, this is really globally the first market, at least to my understanding, or at least global major market, where you have now a clear path on an entire market level for reimbursement. Of course, you have this in the US, for instance, on a payer by payer situation, also in other markets, but these are really individual negotiations. Here you have really for the first time an entire market opening up if you meet certain standards, and of course the bar is high. But I think it's also good because it will distinguish, as I call it always, digital homeopathy from stuff that has real impact and real evidence. And we are a science-driven company, so we are trying to meet these goals. And for us, it's good news that we have this new regulation in place.
Exciting news. Certainly, I saw that announcement in Germany, and of course, Germany has decorated itself very well in terms of its management of COVID-19. So you're right, adds yet more value to that. Let me switch gears. I'm running out of time, or we are all running out of time. I'll come back to you, Girisha. Try to succinctly, I know it's a difficult topic, but succinctly if you can, describe to us the funding environment for digital health startups in Switzerland, stroke Europe, but with our emphasis is of course still on Switzerland. It's a very affluent country, so presumably the roads are paved in gold and people are falling over each other to give you money.
Yeah, I wish, but I think that there's a lot of scrutiny here in Switzerland, and I think we experience a lot of conservatism, which I already mentioned, but it has to, I think, also to do with the market, right? If you look at Switzerland, I saw the slides before. We're based in Basel, right? It's extremely biotech and pharma heavy. So when you talk about biotechs and molecules, yes, that's when they jump. That's when you have 100% attention, right? When you now come in and sort of look at digital health, health tech, this is almost like a new sphere for these investors, especially when it comes to sort of these maybe family offices that are really for the past 50 years have been looking at biotech investments. That's a completely different new language for them to speak, right? It's sort of you're moving away from this traditional biotech to really this digital health aspect, and this is the challenge really that we're facing here in Switzerland, particularly also in Basel. Now, with that said, there are ways I think we're progressing, right? One of these is to sort of see the shift in the traditional molecules or drugs that are coming onto the market. We've seen now several FDA approvals that don't just approve a drug or a therapy, but also approve a companion diagnostic or a digital health solution with that biotech, right? So that emphasizes sort of the coalition that companies are looking for to bring drugs to the market and create value for the patient, but also the healthcare system. One thing I also think is an interesting development in Switzerland is the aspect of the quality of care that we have. Looking at the US, we're number 2 in sort of spend versus the quality that we're achieving, and that's not in a good way, unfortunately. So we could do a lot better on those levels. So we have actually looked at, okay, where are the pain points? Who are the driving forces, the stakeholders that are struggling with that? And we have found out that we can be quite successful when we partner with these stakeholders that have the problem. So funding actually coming from these stakeholders that are facing the problem, such as healthcare insurances, providers. So we're collaborating with a hospital that has their own health tech fund, right? So this is really unprecedented in Switzerland, which we're making use of because we're tackling sort of the problem with these stakeholders that face these problems.
Cool, thank you. Same question to you, Ulrich, but can I just add a bit of a flavor to the question, which is, just picking up a point Girish made, which is the fact that investors tend to be very conventional, or certainly very molecule focused, big IP walls, etc. So has that? Presumably you've seen the same thing. So how does that change your fundraise strategy going forwards? And I guess have you seen a change of attitude from people like Novartis fund or the Roche fund, etc.? Because those two organizations sitting on your doorstep have been very clear that digital health is part of their strategy.
No, I think I would largely echo what Girish was saying, that you see this disconnect, in particular in Basel, where you have a strong life science industry, but 100% molecule driven. And if you talk to the usual suspects, they would rather invest into the 10s or 15s or 50s, whatever oncology molecule company, as opposed to the first digital health company. I think this is a little bit the attitude you're seeing. And I think it's a shame, because I think Basel in particular has the potential to become really, I would say, a life science healthcare hub. I mean, really healthcare defined beyond simply biotech. And I would say it could be even stronger than Boston or the Silicon Valley, because we have both elements here, and definitely we are strong on the pharma side, but we are lacking, I would say, on the tech side. So therefore, since you asked the question, yes, of course, we also talk to those usual suspects, but we also shift more and more our attention to, I would say, strategic investors who see value in what we are doing, because I think they really understand what we are doing. And they also come really from a strategic angle into our discussions, and see our platform or our digital therapeutics we are building as a complement to what they are doing. Novartis in particular, I think, without going too much into detail of my former company here, I think they still have to, I would say, make their mind up where they really are. You see a lot of announcements, also activity, but I think on the funding side, my perspective is that at least the venture fund is still, I would say, mainly on biotech and medtech, but not really on digital. Hence, I think there's some sort of disconnect of what the corporate strategy is doing, as opposed to where their funding pot is going. Whether this remains or not, we'll see. So therefore, I think, as I said, for us at least, as Girish said, other funding sources are probably more attractive, be it insurers, be it healthcare providers or others who really understand the space and also come more, I would say, from an entrepreneurial position towards our company, and less maybe from a financial position.
So one quick,
Julian, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
Sure, just wanted to I think push on the theme, which I think is interesting, has come through, whether it's the regulatory theme, the funding theme, or healthcare provider theme. It's about a mindset change, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether we take the opportunity of COVID not only to make small tactical investments in new things, but do we actually make changes in attitudes? And I think there was an interesting question in the chat about both regulation and also the attitude of the public. And I think one thing that will be interesting to see will be, will investors go, my drug's just been pushed back 2 years by a clinical trial delay, so maybe I'll have a look at this digital health thing, and that could be something. Or will the public say, the government in Switzerland, at least, put together a privacy first, well-built COVID app. It took a little bit of time, but it got there. They are putting my privacy first. And I understand that. So maybe I'm going to trust this whole new electronic health record a bit more than I would have in the past. And I think it will be interesting to see how that changes as well. And from the regulator and government side, they've had to build an app and launch it themselves. Will that experience change their mindset as well? And I think that's sort of just a comment to add there. Back to you, Julian.
Thanks, Doug. Well, I was Girish had a last point to make before I get back to the Singapore team.
Yes, no, just a very crisp point to echo sort of Ulrich and our situation, and especially for the audience, I think this is very interesting. If you're looking to solve a problem for a specific stakeholder, I think the strategic partnering aspect is important. One thing I can definitely say is money is not just money, right? Sometimes, especially in our environment, just money doesn't help. I think if you can really partner up with an entity for which you are solving a problem is worth way more than just getting an investment of several million to do what you have to do. So traction and showing that you can actually solve a problem with the right partner is, in first instance, way more important than just money. So echoing what Ulrich said, if you can really find entities that are looking to invest for which you are solving a problem, this is where it gets really interesting and accelerates your path to success.
Cool, thank you there, Girish. Grace, let me switch to you. My take on the funding contrast, say, between Singapore and Switzerland / Europe is that startups tend to live on a grant mechanism in Europe for a lot longer before they start raising from the private sector. And I think it's a lot less obvious that scenario is a lot less obvious in Singapore. You guys have been raising money for some time now and very successfully. So how would you describe the funding environment then in Singapore? I mean, it's come a long way, hasn't it?
During just in general, or during?
No, in general, yeah, in general. I mean, COVID obviously, it'd be interesting to see your point of view on that. But we've seen Dr. Anywhere raise substantially, so it's not impossible. But sorry, over to you.
Sure, right. Maybe. From the early days, I think, okay, so one of the first things that I think Singapore did really well was actually ensure capital formation and really invested in some of these upstart venture firms. And so they had some of these programs like NRF, and then now I think quite actively it's like Spring or Singapore SE Enterprise. So there are actually government programs for companies that are just starting out now. Which is terrific way, just an avenue, right? But I think overall, I mean, since we've started at DocDoc, it's just been tremendous in terms of the number of venture firms that have come into Singapore and setting up their Asia headquarters here. And so I think that's a testament to the ecosystem, the strength of the ecosystem that's been built here. Dario probably has the exact numbers of the number of VCs. And Singapore as a country, high net worth individuals, there are plenty here, and so are looking to put their money to work and are wanting to help the next generation of leaders in doing something great for society. And so I think as a whole, it's always been it's changed. It's grown tremendously over the years, which is quite noticeable. And, and also, as I think what Ulrich mentioned, there's also corporations, big organizations that actually want to set up their venture arm and also want to look at the startup community in seeing where the strategic partnerships lie. And so it really is truly a partnership where you could see that you're solving their pain points and it's a win-win together. So I think overall there's been an evolution, and I think it's been a very positive one. Cool,
thanks, Grace. Serene, you guys are a little bit earlier in the fundraising roadmap or road versus DocDoc, of course. But what's your take?
So, I mean, first of all, congratulations, Grace, on successful fundraising, and best of luck for your next raise. You are correct to touch upon, the ecosystem and the good government support that's really gone into creating an ecosystem and not just ensuring that there's capital in Singapore. So, Girisha, you said, money is just money, and that's correct. So what the Singapore government has done, the variety of organizations, the Economic Development Board, the Enterprise Singapore, and all the various prior names like what Grace talked about, like Spring, Innovate and stuff like that. What they really invested in, and what the entire government ethos in Singapore is, making homegrown companies that are globally competitive. And I think this has really resulted in a very vibrant and thriving ecosystem. And of course, with COVID, there's a lot more liquidity. Before COVID, I think a lot of money was flowing towards pre-IPO companies, so you kept hearing the same names in the news, like Gojek and Grab, and Carousel. I mean, that's not really healthcare, but you kept hearing the same names in the news. But I think after COVID, there was a lot more liquidity in the system. There's a lot of money sloshing around. Middle Eastern money, Israeli money, US money, China money, and that's definitely not conservative money. And we're seeing valuations like Dr. Anywhere that's going through the roof, and they're able to raise these large rounds. So, I mean, like I said, it's not just money that's in the system. It's a very vibrant and thriving ecosystem that the government has really created for us.
Thanks, Serene. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to do something somewhat un-Swiss. I'm going to overrun slightly, guys, but not by much, I promise. But I'm going to ask different questions to all four of you, so there won't be expectation all four to the same question. Let's throw you at Doug, if I may. Doug, Michael Reben said tech digital gaps in Basel ecosystem were mentioned. It's focused on molecules, but Zurich is quite close, no? Question mark. Are they not close enough to be considered one hub with lots of complementary between the two cities?
Thanks, Julian. I was just typing an answer in the chat, so you saved me that. No, I think yes. There is certainly complementariness, and as an Australian, it does seem strange to think that 60 kilometres is an impenetrable barrier, and I don't think it is. But I think what we need to do is find ways to work together and make those connections. And I think you know, things like Ulrich finding work at, with the University Hospital in Zurich is fantastic. We have companies also doing some work with the University of Basel from Zurich, and I think those connections of people will make that happen. Because I think startups and entrepreneurial work is about making connections between people. And I think the more we can find little bridges, we'll end up building quite a big bridge between Zurich and Basel. And I think we can certainly make that bridge, that barrier. And I think the Swiss will keep that barrier alive in their heads for a long time, even after it has actually, for us working in the industry, will practically have disappeared.
Thanks, Doug. Ulrich, conversation I know is warm to your heart or close to your heart, partnerships and partnerships to scale, let's call it that. What does that look like, very briefly, in view of time, but what would you like to see more of looking forwards in terms of, you know, the attitude of third parties around you, stakeholders around you to actually scale through partnership?
Yeah, so as you said, I mean, partnerships indeed are kind of core to our strategy, because we feel as a startup you have certain strengths and capabilities, which is your agility, which is your capability in quickly developing products, your degree of innovation. But if it comes to scaling, if it comes to global rollout, I would say this is not necessarily the strengths of a startup, and you can either build those capabilities or you partner with somebody who has already built those. And in that vein, in that mentality, we are definitely looking, and we have already partnered with companies with bigger muscles than we have. In particular, like to bring really complementary skills together. We more from the innovation side, the larger partner more having the global footprint, the global scale. So I think from that perspective, that's good, and also for us it makes sense, it works. What I would like to see more of is probably a bit more risk-taking attitude or appetite by the bigger partners. It takes oftentimes quite long to get them convinced to start working with you. And you get pushed and shift between group one and talk to number B and C and D, and you make all the round circle along the org chart of an organization, and you get back to square zero without having really started your project. And as I work quite for some time in Novartis, I know how it works. On the other hand, I would really like to see a bit more risk appetite and come to a decision quicker and say, let's go, put some money at risk. We are not, I think we are prepared to work deliberately and diligently with this kind of investment. But I think you can so much do on PowerPoint, you can so much do in conceptualizing in a workshop. But at the end of the day, you only get to a true result if you really test it in patients or with patients. And there you have to do the experiment. Hence, you have to work with us as a startup and get going.
Thanks, Ulrich. Girish.
There is some hope for cultural change amongst our big friends. So
yeah, it's a super tank. It does not turn around fast. Girish, switching gears slightly, but related to the question I asked Ulrich, and linked to DEFL partnerships. The phenomena, and it's one of the questions in our last poll, the phenomena of the ecosystem or the activity with the ecosystem. What does that look like, feel like in Switzerland as a digital health ecosystem, let's say, and what would you like to see more of?
Absolutely. So I'll just second what Ulrich said in terms of the big corporates, the partnership with them, more proactivity, more openness, more risk taking. But one thing that's close to my heart, which I think, which really would benefit us as a company, but more importantly our customers, is how startups can work together and collaborate to really increase end user value, right? The business value and the patient value that they can provide when they work together. Because we all know, we cannot fix or improve everything in in a healthcare system, right? Even if you have a great digital health app, even if you have a great service for an insurance company, there's still a lot of things that could be improved. And I think building a coalition and working together to increase business value for those end users could be a great benefit for everyone. So that's something that I'd like to definitely see more in Switzerland. I'm sure that there are aspects in Singapore that could be similar. And from an ecosystem perspective, yes, I think the outward look should not be forgotten, right? I think we spend a lot of time in startups, internally think about how we can solve problems and having a certain view on things. But just like when I used to work at Roche, I think a lot of value came from opening your eyes, looking left and right and seeing what's happening and thinking about how these partnerships can bring you further. This can particularly translate into these events, these discussions, this brainstorming that Ulrich mentioned. That I would love to see more of, and hope, of course, that Galen Growth together with Basler can drive this and really bring out the value in these collaborations.
That's the plan, Girish. So thank you for the vote of support for that intent. Grace, switch to you very quickly. Partnerships, you're no stranger to building partnerships with corporates. What's that been like, and how much more do you want to see, or what would you like to see different going forward? One of the big bits of feedback we got from the poll was people would like to see more partnership schemes. I'm not sure how that looks. It was a term used to broadly discuss it, but I mean, what's your point of view there?
Sure. I think maybe just touch upon maybe what Ulrich was mentioning as well. There was this term that was coined, innovation theatrics. I'm not sure if you've heard of that. And so it's, are you just going through the motions, or are you actually solving the pain point and actually giving the value down to the end user at the end of the day? And, I think in the early days, what we've seen in Singapore is, a lot of the players, both sides, startups as well as corporates, who are very keen to partner, and it was done in a manner, perhaps it was free, or it wasn't really thought through in detail in terms of what does success look like at the end of this. Typically these cycles are 18 to 24 months, and clearly explaining or what success looks like on both sides at the get-go, and that's what takes a long time. What exactly is the cost structure? What exactly is, key performance metrics? Who is going to be the champion? Do we have the CEO buy-in? There's just a myriad of things that needs to be actually ironed out up front before that marriage, so to speak, can actually happen. And if any parts of those skips plus many more are not done, it could actually lead to problems down the road and a failed partnership, which no one would like to have. But, I think right now what we're seeing is that, especially with COVID, it's like, yikes, let's actually give policyholders the value we need. We'll have to pay for it because we'll pay for the value, the real value that is going to come down to that end user.
And I guess one of the advantages that Singapore has, correct me if I'm wrong, is that many of the regional MNC decision makers sit on your doorstep, don't they?
Exactly. I mean, I just, maybe I go back to my corporate days. I mean, that's part of the reason why, Singapore has been selected. But maybe just as a shout out, I know that you're just about to wrap up this, is that a huge part of building out an ecosystem is the community. And, I think what you have done under your leadership and what Galen Growth has done is tremendous, because it has brought together the place to discuss between startups, entrepreneurs, corporates, venture, all of them all together to talk about digital health and really get deep into the topics.
Thanks, Grace. I'll send you to check later. No, thank you very much. And we're hoping to obviously replicate that here, because the talent and the innovation here is fantastic. Serene, don't want to leave you without an answer. So just building on Grace's point, not looking for a plug, but just looking at Grace's point around the importance of an ecosystem and a community to you and to SpeedDoc.
Yeah, so like what Grace said, very much, it's not just, startups or corporations that are looking to innovate. Very often we see these pilot programs, like Grace said, 12 to 18 months, and often they're not sustainable. And in commercial terms, sometimes there's a lot of doubt whether it can be monetized, whether there's a product market fit. And I think, just to round things off, partnership schemes, actually, it's not really a partnership scheme. It's really a whole of ecosystem scheme. And as a startup and as a corporate, where do you fit in the industry? Where do you fit in the landscape of healthcare in general? And where do you fit in the world? And are you bringing value to your consumers? So, I mean, that's what I'm going to end with.
Thank you very much, Serene. There are many more questions, both from audience as well as on my piece of paper here, but I'm conscious of time, and I'm sure you guys have all got to run on to other things, including lunch, for those of you in Switzerland. So big thank you to all my panel members today, and for your great participation, your energy, your frank answers, and certainly starting to lift a lid on your respective ecosystems, which are remarkably similar in terms of size of ecosystem and in terms of depth of innovation. So the very best of you all is your journey in H2 2020, which hopefully should be a lot more bouncy, exciting than H1. Looking forward to certainly hearing more from you in relation to your journeys as you go forward. Doug, thank you very much for the opportunity to continue to prove that the partnership between Galen Growth and Basilea and Day One will continue to foster cooperation, collaboration, community, and of course innovation, and get these exciting solutions in the hands of HCPs and patients. I don't know if you want to say any last words yourself, all the way from Greece, but thank you.
No, just I think it was great to hear at the end there a focus on moving away from innovation theatre to real value and punishment. I think that's the focus. Like as a digital health community, we have to deliver value and prove ourselves. And when we do that, the investors will come, the insurers will change their mindsets, HCPs will get on board. I think that's key.
Great, thank you, Doug. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Serene. Thank you, Girisha, for your time. It's always very appreciated, and certainly it's lovely to see you guys prepared to put back into the ecosystem and help everybody along a little bit further forward. Have a great rest of your day, a good evening to Singapore, and a good afternoon. Bon appetit to everyone in Switzerland.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.